aged, mellowed, and blended with other fine crops, is in the Luckies you buy today. No wonder that with independent experts, with men who know tobacco best, it's Luckies 2-to-1. Mr. Fadiman, have I shown that it's worthwhile to smoke the smoke tobacco experts smoke?
Mr. Cross, you've rendered a very complete accounting of the reasons, and in only 58 seconds. Now, Miss Strother and gentlemen, we'll go on with the second half of the program. Here's one from Hollywood, California, from Bernice Cornell. It's about famous ifs in poetry. Let's get 3 out of 4. I guess Mr. Roosevelt would call this an iffy question. It's full of ifs. If it were done. If it were done, Mr. Kieran.
If it were done, when 'twere done, then 'twere well that 'twere done quickly. Hamlet.
Yes.
Yes, Hamlet.
No, Macbeth.
Macbeth.
Very good. What is Macbeth thinking about?
He has a little matter of murder on his mind.
That's right. Which he disposes of pretty quickly. That's a very famous sentence in a famous speech. Now, here's another if. If all the land were apple pie...
And all the something were
drink. Ah, you all do remember that. Can you go on with it, Mr. Strother and gentlemen?
What should we have to
drink?
Yes, a little ragged. And all the trees were bread and cheese. What should we have for a drink? Who wrote it, Mr. Adams?
Anon.
Anon is right this time. Here's another if. If love were what the rose is. Oh, we have 3 hands on that. Mr. Adams.
Swinburne.
Swinburne is right. How does it go on? Do you remember the rest of the if?
There's several stanzas, and they all begin with if. If
That's
you were
fair
April's
enough.
lady and I were Lord of May is another one.
That gives
If love
us...
were like the roses.
That's the one.
And I were like the leaf.
That's good. Our lives would grow together in sad or singing weather and so forth. And what's the poem called, Mr. Kieran? A Match. Very good, by Swinburne. Here's another if. And if sometimes our conduct isn't all your fancy paints, Mr. Kieran.
Single men in something barracks don't grow into plaster saints, by Rudyard Kipling.
Yes, the poem called?
That's Tommy Atkins.
Tommy Atkins, yes, very good, Mr. Kieran. Well, that gives us all 4 ifs out of 4. You're doing very well this evening, gentlemen. Now, how about this, from Robert Pollock of Brooklyn? This is a question about heredity. I'm going to pose some questions about resemblances of children to their parents. Let us take the case of Mr. and Mrs. A. Mr. and Mrs. A are both blue-eyed, and they'd like a little variety in their home. That's what it says here. The phrasing is a little odd. I mean, they hope to have a brown-eyed baby. You see, they're both blue-eyed, and they hope to have a brown-eyed baby. Now, what are the probabilities of their hopes coming true? Mr. Huxley?
Well, none, unless they were one of the or other of them was a candidate for Reno.
I see what you mean, yes. Almost immediately, should we say. Why would the chances
You really
be
don't
slim?
mean Mr. and Mrs. A. My folks do you?
Now, Mr. Huxley, why would the chances of having a brown-eyed baby resulting from 2 blue-eyed children be rather slim? Could you explain briefly to us?
Well, because the blue eye is what is called a recessive and the brown eye a dominant, and you can be brown-eyed and yet have blue in the background, so to speak, so that it can come out in the children.
Yes.
You can't with the blue.
Very good. All parents who are listening in who have eyes that are blue and would like a brown-eyed baby, just out of luck. Now let us take the case of Mr. and Mrs. B, just to get away from your folks, Mr. Adams. Now, Mr. and Mrs. B are both brunettes. They're both brunettes, and they're very anxious to have a blonde-haired baby. What's the probability of their wishes coming true? Can anyone, Mr. Huxley, will you help us out again?
Well, it's perfectly possible.
Yes, it is quite possible. Why?
Well, for the same reason, for the opposite reason that we had over the blue eye.
But I can't carry that in my head. We had that only 30 seconds ago. You want to rephrase it for us, Mr. Huxley?
Because you can be a brunette and yet have the hereditary factor for blonde in your constitution, and if each of the parents had that factor, then 1 out of 4 children on the whole would be, on the average, would be blonde.
Well, that's fair enough. Very good, and I think very clear, Mr. Huxley. Now, how about another one? This is the sad case of Mr. and Mrs. C. Now, Mr. and Mrs. C are both very short, And they've been pushed around most of their lives, being very small people, and they're looking forward to having a big, strapping son. Now, I know the chances are Mr. Adams. Mr. Adams, what do you know
The
about
chances
this?
are not only tremendous, they happen.
You say that with some feeling.
I know it's so.
You know it's so? Yeah, so what, is very true. The answer that Mr. Adams gave is correct, but Mr. Huxley, you know as well as I do that Mr. Adams hasn't the slightest idea why. Mr. Kieran?
I don't think that size is inherited with the genes.
Mr. Huxley, can you help out Mr.
yes,
Kieran on that?
it's inherited, but it's a good deal more complicated than the blue versus brown.
Yes.
Also, it's much more easily modified by diet and environment.
Yes, so that perhaps is the important point. The diet and environment might produce tall children, Miss
Right.
Mother.
It's a matter of blue jeans, that's what it comes down to.
Oh, come. Have you been mulling that over in that lovely little head of yours all
No,
evening?
just thought of it.
Well, the point is that this possibility is perfectly reasonable that the short parents would have a very tall son. On the other hand, they might have a short one, too, or they might have a daughter. Or they might, they might try and just not have anything at all. You can't tell. Now, here we have a question from Mr. Paul Rowell of Fayette, Idaho. Get 2 out of 3 on this if you can. I want you to name the character in fiction, literature, a character who seeks to plant evidence of guilt for his crime upon the following people. The character who seeks to plant evidence of guilt upon a weaver. Upon a weaver. Who is that? Any idea? Mr. Adams?
Is the weaver bottom?
No. That throws you out of the game, then. All right. There's another weaver, not quite as well known as Bottom. In Silas Marner by George Eliot, the character William Dane tries to plant the guilt of stealing the guilt on Silas Marner. Remember that? Who is a weaver and a miser? Well, now, name the character who seeks to plant evidence of guilt upon 2 grooms. 2 grooms, Mr. Kieran.
Mr. Macbeth.
Yeah. No, I beg your pardon. That's not quite right.
Well, his wife did.
Oh, yeah.
Lady
Well,
Macbeth.
we should make a distinction, I think. Lady Macbeth goes back after Macbeth has...
Smears the faces of the posset-drugged groom.
Ah, well, you really know it, Mr. Kieran. I take it all back. It was just a little slip. Yes, Lady Macbeth does the smearing of the faces of the grooms, but the actual murder is done by Mac himself. Now the character who seeks to plant evidence of guilt upon a village drunk. Upon a village drunk. A drunk, in our language, Mr. Huxley, what do you call them over there?
Drunk.
Yeah, drunk. Yeah. How about that? Don't know, gentlemen?
Rip Van Winkle.
No, wrong, Mr. Adams. I'm awfully sorry. It's Injun Joe and Tom Sawyer who kills young Dr. Robinson in the graveyard, and then he puts the bloody knife into Muff Potter's hand. Remember that? Does it come back to you at all? Well, I think it should. Mr. Kieran, it does come back to... Well, that's good. 1 out of 2, that's enough. That sends us on to a question from Mrs. Milton Sen of Philadelphia. Name a specific ingredient which is responsible for the difference between these substances. Raisins and grapes. What makes the difference, Mr. Huxley?
Well, there's more sugar in the raisins.
I think not necessarily. I don't think that's what makes the distinctive difference, Mr. Adams.
A raisin is a grape that is dried.
So what ingredient, or the lack of what ingredient, makes the difference?
Water.
Yes, I think water is the simple and correct answer. How about the difference between bread and toast? What's the ingredient that makes the difference, Mr. Kieran?
Heat.
No, the ingredient. Heat is certainly the condition. Yes, Mr. Huxley.
Water.
Some water is removed, but what more important change takes place when bread is converted into toast?
Says,
Mr. Kieran?
well, you have carbon formed there.
Yes, you do have a little burning, but what I was thinking of was that the starch is changed to dextrin. When I say what I was thinking, I mean I can read that off this card that I have here. It says the starch is changed to dextrin. I think we have to call that wrong. Now, how about cider and vinegar? What's the difference? What ingredient's responsible for the difference, Mr. Huxley?
Well, acetic acid versus alcohol.
Yes, acetic acid in vinegar is the thing that's added. I don't know if there's alcohol in cider in all of its forms, is there? I say that hopefully.
Yes, in all forms.
all
if it
forms?
really deserves the name of cider.
Ah, well, I guess some that I've drunk doesn't deserve the name of cider, then. Here's one from Mrs. L.C. Upshaw of Laurel, Mississippi. Can you give the first and last words of a line of poetry? No, I'll give you the first and last words, and you give me the whole line. Get 2 out of 3 on this. Here's the first word, O, and the last word is enow. What's the whole line of poetry? Mr. Huxley. Miss Strother.
A wilderness for paradise enow.
Yes, very good, from the Rubaiyat. Here's the first word, when. The last word, spent. What's the line? Mr. Adams.
When I consider how my light is spent.
Very good, Mr. Adams. And what's the line from?
On Milton's blindness.
Yes, very Milton.
On his blindness.
Yes, very good, Mr. Adams. That's not an easy line to remember. And here, in this case, the first and last words are the same. The first is roll, and the last word is roll. Mr. Kieran?
Roll on, thou dark and deep blue ocean, roll.
How does it go from there on? Remember?
Time writes no wrinkles on thine azure brow. That's part of it.
That's part of it, yes.
Part of it.
10,000 fleets sweep over thee in vain from Childe Harold by Byron. I guess that's all we have time for. And now Mr. Cross points out that besides the government stamp on every package of Luckies, there's another sort of stamp that's most important, if quite invisible.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's the stamp of approval of independent tobacco experts. At auctions all over the South, these experts see just who buys what tobacco and the prices paid. And they show their approval of the tobacco sold American by their own overwhelming preference for Luckies. In fact, sworn records show that among independent tobacco experts, auctioneers, buyers, and warehousemen, Lucky Strike has twice as many exclusive smokers as have all the other cigarettes combined. The reason's clear. These experts know that Lucky Strike means fine tobacco because at market after market, year after year, they see us consistently pay the price to get the milder, better-tasting leaf. For example, at auctions in Franklin, Tennessee, season of 1939, we paid 24% above the average market price published by the United States Department of Agriculture. At Conway, South Carolina, 35% more, and so on. And that crop, properly aged, mellowed, and blended with other fine crops, is in the Luckies you buy today. No wonder that with independent experts, with men who know tobacco best, it's Luckies 2-to-1. Smokers, since you know that in a cigarette it's the tobacco that counts, isn't the stamp of the tobacco expert's approval definitely worth acting on?
Thank you, Mr. Cross. This evening, Lucky Strike has paid out 2 $50 defense bonds and 2 sets of the Britannica. Thank you, Miss Strother and Mr. Huxley, for lending your talents to Lucky Strike's party tonight. Now, next week, we'll have Mr. Kieran, Mr. Levant, Mr. Adams, and as our guest, the impeccable Adolphe Monjou, whose most recent screen vehicle you'll know to be Roxy Hart. Remember, for every question answered correctly, the sender gets $10 in defense stamps, and for every question that stumps our board, you get a total of a $50 defense bond, plus the complete 24-volume set of the Encyclopedia Britannica. Send your letters with questions and the correct answers to Information Please at 480 Lexington Avenue, New York City. And now, a parting message from Mr. L.A. Speed Riggs, famous tobacco auctioneer from Goldsboro, North Carolina.
Hail, hail.